Good afternoon to everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this webinar on post-secondary pathways, where we are joined by three terrific guests who are going to talk with us about the issue of reopening college campuses. Before we get started, I'm going to turn things over to the Hunt Institute's president and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, who's going to give us some brief welcoming remarks. Over to you, Javed.
Thanks, James, and thanks to everybody for joining us for our Post-Secondary Pathways webinar. Today's conversation about reopening higher education campuses couldn't be more timely. Institution leaders have been planning meticulously for this moment all summer, and some have already put those plans into action while others will do so in the coming days or weeks. Every institution of higher education has a different set of circumstances that must be considered in decisions about whether to reopen physical campuses. We also know that disruptions caused by the pandemic have disproportionately affected higher education students of color, low-income students, and rural students. Institution leaders have to take this dynamic into account to ensure that reopening plans do not compound this critical issue. Lastly, it is important to note that in many areas of the country, the pandemic continues to be a rapidly evolving situation that requires leaders to make daily adjustments to their plans. We don't have to look beyond our own backyard with what's going on in UNC Chapel Hill. With so many moving pieces, it can be difficult to make sense of campus reopening conversations. Thankfully for us, we have three experts with us today who can shed some light on these decisions and what we can expect in the coming weeks and months. We're glad to have our friend Peter Blake from the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, Dr. Aaron Thompson, who's the president of the Kentucky Council of Postsecondary Education, and Dr. Robert Keltrin, an associate professor and department chair from Seton Hall University, who has been tracking and analyzing campus reopening plans across the country. I'm excited about this conversation. So with that, James, I'll kick it back to you to get the conversation going.
Great. Thanks, Javed. I am excited as well, and we want to jump right in. Just a couple of super brief housekeeping notes from me. The first is that we have time for audience Q&A on the back end of this webinar. We look forward to your questions. We ask that you submit them using the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom app. Please note we're not going to be unmuting lines, so we do ask that you use that Q&A feature. You should also feel free to follow along on Twitter using the hashtag postpathways. Please feel free to submit questions on Twitter as well. And I'll also mention that we are broadcasting this on Facebook Live as well. So if that's easier for anyone else, please feel free to join us via Facebook. So let's jump right in. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give a brief introduction to themselves. We'll start with Peter, then we'll go to Dr. Thompson, and then to Robert. So Peter, would love if you could start by talking a little bit about SCHEV and the role that it plays in Virginia's higher education ecosystem, and also how you all have shifted your work a little bit in response to the pandemic.
Sure. Thank you, James. Javed, thank you for the words of welcome, and particularly calling attention right at the outset to the unequal impact that this pandemic is having on students of color and others across the nation. So a little bit about SCHEV, the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. We're the coordinating board for Virginia higher education. We're an executive branch agency with responsibility to serve both the governor as well as the legislature. Our mission is to advocate for and promote the development and operation of an educationally and economically sound, vigorous, progressive, and coordinated system of higher education. In the Commonwealth, we have statutory requirements to lead state-level strategic planning and policy development, implementation, and to facilitate collaboration among institutions of higher ed that will enhance quality and create operational efficiencies. All that's from the Code of Virginia. We also work very closely with the colleges, universities on board development and orientation programs for that. We have 15 public four-year institutions, 24 two-year institutions, 30 private nonprofit institutions, and literally hundreds of other private and out-of-state degree and non-degree granting institutions. We're the 11th largest public system. We have over 300,000 full-time equivalent students. Our colleges, universities confer over 120,000 degrees and certificates every year. We work very closely with the governor's office, the legislatures, their staff, our college and university leaders, and with advocacy groups. So as you can tell, these are people-intensive responsibilities, and the pandemic has certainly compromised our ability to work as effectively as we would like, but we're adapting. We have a 13-member board that has not met in person since January. We have advisory committees made up of presidents, chief academic officers, and finance officers, also none of whom have met together since January. We have an annual Board of Visitors training session coming up in October. We'll do that virtually. And our legislature is meeting today in a special session. And while they're meeting in the House of Delegates, for instance, is meeting in the basketball stadium at Virginia Commonwealth University, socially distanced, most of their work will be done, I'm imagining, virtually through at the committee level. So you won't be able to have that one-on-one relationship. So that's really what we're missing as part of the pandemic, and which I think compromises our ability to do our work as effectively as we would like. But certainly we're learning new ways of communicating and to try to create some of that serendipity that happens in interpersonal relationships, and doing it virtually instead. So that's where we are, that's what we do, and a little bit about how the pandemic has been affecting our work.
Great, thanks very much, Peter. I think a lot of us are thinking through those same questions about how to replicate some of the in-person experience in this new virtual setting. So let us know if you figure it out, because we would love to know. Dr. Thompson, I'd love if you could similarly give some opening remarks about CPE, kind of the role that you all play in Kentucky, and similar to Peter, talk a little bit about how the work has shifted because of the pandemic.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Javed, for inviting us to be a part of this conversation. Like Peter, I won't go through some of the pieces he went through, so we're similar. We are the higher education body for the state of Kentucky. We are a coordinating board, but a fairly interesting coordinating board. We have some governing powers. We set the tuition ceilings, we set the strategic agenda for the state. We push the performance funding model where the money is distributed throughout the campuses. We set the minimum admissions criteria for each of the campuses and so on. So we coordinate 8 public universities, 16 public community colleges and technical colleges, but we also license our private nonprofits and for-profits if they offer a baccalaureate degree. And for them to exist in the state, they have to go through us and have their curriculum approved and faculty credentials and so on. The item that I would spend a little time talking about is that over the many years, we've done a pretty good job of focusing on our mission to provide a quality of life for Kentucky that matters, and higher education being the key to making that matter. And over the last many years, we've had significant funding cuts, but while at the same time, we've increased our educational attainment. We have the North Star of 60% by 2030. We've increased that tremendously. And a lot of that's due to behavioral change, focusing on efficiencies, but yet effective processes and behavior. And I'm proud to say that CPE has kind of guided that. I mean, surely we're the universities and colleges, that's where the rubber meets the road, but we kind of help them to kind of build a car to make that happen. We also have a fairly in-depth strategic agenda, but when I came aboard, I wanted to break that down to 4 significant priorities, knowing that if everybody can wrap themselves around this, then we can achieve something. The first one is around talking about the value of higher education. And we know that, in fact, there's been a hit on higher ed and whether or not it's valuable. Well, all the research and data are showing that it's extremely valuable. They're valuable, not just with the amount of income you make over a lifetime, but your health, your civic engagement, and so on. So the first priority, really focusing on why higher education matters in Kentucky. So we went on listening to business and industry, students, parents, everybody. So we talked over 3,000 people over the last year before the pandemic and finding that out. The second one is focusing on affordability. Whether it's real or whether it's perceived, it's a big issue. We only have about 51.7% of our high school graduating class going to college. And so I'm proud to say the last 2 years, we've had the lowest tuition rates in almost 3 decades, at 0.73 this past year. And that's with 11 years of budget cuts from the state. So second one is around affordability. The third one is around the things that we haven't been able to move, and that's not leaving anybody behind. It's increasing our attainment rate, but making sure that we focus on those that have been historically the most disenfranchised from that attainment rate, those that have the opportunity gaps. And so I'm proud to say we've increased them all, but we've had a significant gap closing in Kentucky. For an example, of the last 5 years, we're up somewhere around 27% of our students of color from their baseline. So we are moving that agenda forward. And the last one is really talking about the quality of what we do and the degrees we offer and the credentials. So getting employers engaged on the front end versus the back end is a way that we're focusing on that, along with those employability outcomes we feel they should have. Now, over the last year, we still haven't moved away from that. That's my point of telling you that piece. We're still focused on that. We may be focused on it now in a more concentrated virtual manner. For an example, I meet with the presidents every week now versus every month because things are changing so fast. Yes, we're focusing on safety, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but we're also focusing on having great educational attainment and great academic endeavors, so we don't forget that. We're also focusing on how we then serve our students in a virtual environment, whether it's with the academic or the social and emotional piece of the students. How do we create a student service system that really matters, which are really needed? And we also haven't backed away from arguing to our other constituent groups, our legislature, governor's office, and others, talking about even in time of short revenue, even in time of COVID, it's going to take higher education to get us through this, and it's going to take higher education to build that long-term economic infrastructure to help us to thrive. And we can't get fifth from the bottom in poverty unless we focus on that. So our campus presidents, myself, and others haven't moved from that North Star, and we just have to be strategic and better during this time of crisis, and that's what leadership is.
Thanks, Dr. Thompson. A lot of great points that I'm looking forward to hearing you expand on throughout the discussion. And I think as Javed touched on, the importance of monitoring those equity gaps and trying to narrow them is even more important during a time like this. Robert, would love if you could give some brief opening remarks now, talk a little bit about your role at Seton Hall and your work, and in particular, kind of the aspect of your work that's happened over the last summer, as I know you've been tracking and analyzing some of these campus reopening plans. So would love if you could touch on some of those things.
Sure, and thanks for having me, and I really appreciate being a part of this panel. I'm a department chair and associate professor of higher education at Seton Hall. This is the start of my second year as department chair. The first year ended up being a little bit more interesting than expected, with the pandemic coming, but thankfully I study higher ed finance and accountability, how a college is run, where the money comes from and where it goes. And keeping an ear to the ground as to what was going on gave me at least a couple days on campus before everything shut down in March to try to get everyone ready for potentially being away from campus for months. And I was just back on campus for the first time last week since March 13th. It looked considerably different. There were desks and tables in classrooms that were just piled to the ceilings because you have to take them out of somewhere. Plexiglass, hand sanitizer, signage. It's just a different experience. And colleges are struggling with what do they do for fall? Part of it is based on whatever the virus looks like in their area. Thankfully, I'm in New Jersey, which was hit among the hardest to start and is now one of the better states. It depends on institutional finances. Can they afford to be online? Can they afford to spend what is needed in person? What will students do? So I've been oddly fascinated by colleges' announcements for fall, or in some cases not making announcements for fall. And the announcements seem to go in a few different ways. For public universities, especially in more conservative states, they've had to, by and large, stay physically open because that's what the legislature and governing boards are demanding. Tuition-driven private colleges are trying to stay open on campus as well because they need the money. And I'm at Seton Hall, we're in the latter category. And as soon as the governor let us reopen, we have students back on campus and we have our first positive COVID case as well. I'm optimistic things will work out fairly well, but it's too early to tell at this point. And then community colleges, many of them went online, but the ones that didn't, they seem to get local support. And then the Ivies went and did their own thing, but they have billions of dollars to do whatever they want. Not exactly a concern of my work here. And this is going to continue to evolve as UNC shows that colleges may try to come back in person, they may fail, or colleges may try to come back in person and they may end up succeeding. But the key point here is if you have students coming to campus from any distance, you basically have one shot at having students on campus in the fall. If you're a commuter institution, you may have multiple chances. But part of the pressure is on colleges. Many of them have one shot to get it right. And if they don't, the financial costs of failing are substantial. Many colleges are already doing layoffs and furloughs and pay cuts. I've already taken a pay cut. I've lost support staff due to layoffs and had many of my students furloughed. It's a brutal environment and it could very well get worse before it gets better. So I'm keeping an eye on where things are going financially and what looks to be coming up over the next few months.
Thanks, Robert. That's a great segue into the both Peter and Dr. Thompson about some of those decisions that schools are actually making. I do see that some folks are raising their hand in the chat. I think I may be frozen right now.
You're unfrozen now.
I'm unfrozen now. I apologize.
Yeah.
I apologize for that little glitch there. I was just saying what a great transition Robert's remarks are into our first question, which is going to go to Peter. Can you all hear me now?
Yes,
okay.
James.
Wonderful. Sorry about that. So Peter, Robert talked a little bit about nationwide trends and what sort of decisions are being made. I know that Chev has been reviewing and certifying campus reopening plans to make sure that they are in line with Governor Northam's higher ed reopening guidance. I would love if you could talk a little bit about what that process looks like and what sort of things you're seeing in terms of common trends in the sorts of decisions that some institution leaders have been making.
Yeah, thanks, James. So you mentioned Governor Northam issuing guidance. That was on June 11th, which seems like a century ago, given everything that has transpired since then. And so we worked in close cooperation with the Virginia Department of Health and with the governor's office on developing the guidance. The governor required all degree granting institutions in Virginia to develop a plan that adhered to the guidance. That's over 90 institutions then prepared plans, submitted them to Chev. And the plans had to address 4 broad categories dealing with the repopulation of the campus, monitoring the health conditions to detect infection, containment to prevent spread of the disease when detected, and then shutdown considerations. So 4 broad categories with a number of sub-issues within them. And they submitted the plans to us on July the 6th. We'd completed our review of the plans by the end of the month. We also asked the institutions to post their plans on the website. On their website, we wanted to keep this process as transparent as possible. And then we, of course, have developed our own website that has on it all the institutions' plans listed on that site as well. You know, the plans and the subsequent revisions, they varied by institutions. They were based on local conditions. Robert already mentioned a couple of considerations that would exist. So the things dealing with the region in which you live or the institution is located certainly has something to do with it. We had a much higher incident of cases in the Hampton Roads area, so Norfolk State, Old Dominion University, Christopher Newport, William and Mary would have a different consideration than an institution in the western part of the state, say a Radford. And so that's certainly the location and the incident of the disease is one of the considerations. Robert mentioned the financial considerations. So universities that are associated with a medical center or teaching hospital had greater access, for instance, to certain kinds of testing capacity that other institutions might not have. So that was a consideration where you saw some variation. I commend our institutions for working very closely with their local health departments on issues like testing and contact tracing. Everybody might not have gotten everything that they wanted, but they worked well together to overcome some of the largest obstacles. And so as of today, and things are changing, we have 2 of our public institutions that are open with students enrolled in classes currently. 3 more, I believe, plan to open next week. We have 5 that have delayed their opening by a couple of weeks. We've had others that have delayed and begun online instruction to begin with. So I would imagine not until middle of September would we have every institution up and running in the way that their plans anticipated that they would run, realizing, as I said at the beginning, that these change really by the minute and by the day. We've only had 1 major institution, a private institution, Hampton University, that announced early on that it was entirely online with no students on campus. So, and interestingly, that announcement followed an announcement the previous week in which they said they would be testing all students when they arrived on campus. So there was, a large amount of optimism one day, and then as conditions changed, stepping away from that and realizing that the safest and most effective way for it to operate would be to go entirely online. So those are some of the kinds of things that we saw through our review of the institutional plans. Again, wide variation depending on region, locality, relationship to local health departments, availability of testing, financial resources, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. That's a very helpful breakdown. And I think one theme of this conversation has been how fluid everything is and how things are changing day by day. So appreciate you giving us your perspective on how that's playing out in Virginia. Dr. Thompson, would love to ask you a very similar question because I know that CPE has played a similar role. I know that, like Chev, you've worked very closely with the Kentucky Department of Public Health, and I know that you've been reviewing campus reopening plans for institutions. So I would love if you could talk a little bit about your process and also whether some of the things Peter highlighted are things that you're also seeing in Kentucky, or whether there are any other trends that are notable.
Yeah, we maybe had a little bit of a difference. The governor early had said to me, Aaron, this is your show. Figure out whether the campuses have it together or not, work with the campuses. So he did not get involved in issuing any sort of direct orders for what we needed to do or not needed to do in that case. A couple other points I want to make, though. The governor early with executive order really started closing down things early. So, and because of that, we've been able to, mitigate some items other states have dealt with. We still have seen another surge, obviously, but we're looking at how we can open all of our institutions with at least some face-to-face if they so choose to do that. And as of right now, every single institution has done that. I guess I want to start, though, before getting to that point and just say this. We designed what I call the 50,000-foot set of competencies. Each of our institutions, both those that we quote unquote coordinate and have some governing powers with, as well as those that we license, that all of them had to go through our office before they actually reopened. And, or I tell people, none of our institutions ever really closed, we just went online. So that's the other misnomer, we call it reopen. Well, they did. We're talking about actually coming back face to face. And so we created those guidelines, working with the campuses to make sure they were reasonable. Then the campuses designed a plan around those big guidelines and then submitted to us. We went back and forth and all the plans were submitted and approved. We had one little glitch, not a glitch, but an exception, I should say, and that was in May. What we had somewhere around 3,800 technical students who they needed to have that last piece of hands-on work in order to get their degree and get a job, or get their certificate and get a job. So we worked with our community and technical college system and our P-12 system and provided a safe way to make that happen. No one caught COVID, and we actually did make that happen. Over the summer, people were all online, had no face-to-face. Now, everybody's opening either in some face-to-face format or at least in a hybrid approach. So all of our institutions have done things like give faculty some options to choose what they felt the most comfortable with, you know, and many of them did mix processes, some face-to-face and some online. Some large lectures obviously have broken down to many different lectures. The in-person semester in some of our cases began early last week, but all of our institutions are letting out around Thanksgiving. We have one particular institution starting a little bit later who will be doing online finals basically after Thanksgiving. And we have our residence halls, in some cases like our big flagship campus, everybody has their own room, if you will. But some, we obviously have two to the room, but the way we have it set up, we're providing them with a way to be safe. You know, dine and go has become the classic way of thinking about how we're doing business. And we've hired staff to do testing or at least self-assessments, working with the students, contact tracing. Many of our institutions like the University of Kentucky, University of Louisville, we have med schools. So that created another opportunity for us to do testing. And University of Kentucky and University of Louisville set up field hospitals when we thought there was going to be a big surge, and we're able and ready to do that again almost immediately. We obviously have mask policies, social distance policies. We have all of those things in place. The item though that I will tell you that I just want to, you're going to hear me every time you ask me something, I'm going to bring this back. We have to be careful that we think it's as simple as either face-to-face or online. We have about 25% of our population as a part of this digital divide. And so even though we provided hotspots for them in higher education for both them and K-12, we assisted, but we also know, and laptops and so on, but we also know we didn't catch everybody. So as we have this conversation about keeping people safe, please understand that we had gaps even when we were face-to-face. And this digital divide has offered another way of thinking about gaps. Now we're going to learn from it, hopefully, but we're making sure that those that are the most removed, if you will, from great learning, that we reach out to them especially. So our campuses are focusing on doing that in addition. One last piece, this mental health issue is huge. We've had some money in our office to help our campuses build a digital platform or some way to help with this issue. And we know during this time, it's going to even be more huge, if you will. And so these are the things we need to be talking about also, other than just peer instruction as we have this conversation.
Thanks, Dr. Thompson. That makes a lot of sense. I think I appreciate you flagging the larger context. A lot of times these conversations have been sort of narrow, but there really are so many factors and so many moving pieces that go into these decisions. So we appreciate that. Quick housekeeping note, some folks have been raising their hand. I want to remind folks that we are not going to unmute lines, so we would ask that you submit your questions using the Q&A feature. Robert, over to you. As you mentioned, you've been tracking some of these decisions throughout the summer and thinking through kind of what pressure points might be forcing people to make those decisions. I guess I just ask you to react to what we just heard from Peter and from Dr. Thompson. How does that line up with your understanding of how these decisions have been evolving over time?
Yeah, these decisions have been evolving considerably over the last few months, with the goal of student safety being balanced with the goal of keeping campuses operable, quite frankly, because some campuses, if they can't bring students back, may be forced to make drastic cuts or close. So colleges tried to be as flexible as possible in getting students back to campus. Now, the challenge is in much of the country, the virus got worse over the summer, and that forced some colleges to go more online than they were planning. In other cases, the virus may not have been the issue in that local area, but they couldn't get testing. And that's a real concern for many small colleges that don't have partnerships with medical systems, that it can be a 7 to 10 day backup to get tests. And at that point, that's difficult to do. Also, in some states, quarantine requirements have made reopening much more difficult. I'm in New Jersey, and if you're coming from 30 some odd states, you have to, or you're supposed to do at least a 2-week quarantine before going out in public. And all of those factors end up raising the price tag for colleges trying to reopen. But in some states, the colleges themselves don't really have the choice. So for the North Carolina example, it was the system board that was responsible for making determinations about colleges opening or closing, at least initially. And some colleges may not have the authority to make their own changes, or in other cases, they fear pushback from whatever module they're going. College presidents right now are in a really tough spot because some students are pushing for in-person classes, some students are pushing for online classes. Faculty seem to be pushing a little bit more for online versus in person, but there are faculty who also want in person. Alumni and parents have their preferences, and we all know that legislators do. So presidents are trying to balance all these factors to make their decisions with not as much information as they would like, and with guidance from many states and the federal government seemingly changing on a weekly basis.
Yep. Thanks very much, Robert. We are going to jump into some audience questions, and Robert, you perfectly anticipated the first one, which is from Liz Wellen from the Hetchinger Report, who asks, now that we've seen what happened at UNC Chapel Hill, what lessons should other large public institutions be taking away from the experience that folks at Chapel Hill just went through? Robert, you touched on this a little bit, so I wonder if Peter and then Dr. Thompson, I wonder if you have anything to respond to in terms of potential lessons learned from the situation at UNC Chapel Hill.
James, you want me to add on to what Robert has said, or you want to yield to Robert to add some more? I'm sorry, I missed the
I was
intro.
going to yield to you, Peter, to go ahead
Okay.
and add on to what Robert said.
Well, not knowing all the circumstances that went on in North Carolina, I don't know what they've done to know whether I could learn anything from them. So, but I do think working with the local community is really important. You know, I think a place like Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, where the town council put a limit on the number of the size gatherings of individuals within Blacksburg, and had a limit on alcohol sale, which I think is a little bit late. They said midnight, but in any event, so working with your local community, because a lot of whatever spread will occur is going to happen off campus. And so having an appreciation of that, and how do you work with the community is certainly a lesson that I hope we can learn from. And that relates also then to your relationships with your health departments. And I've come back to that a couple of times. Those kinds of relationships are really valuable. And then wherever possible, communicate, you know, over communicate with your students on things like regular health screenings, and not going out if you don't feel well, and you know, practicing all the things that we know that we should be practicing. So working with the community, self-isolating when you need to, and then communicating broadly are a couple of things that come to mind.
Thanks very much, Peter. Dr. Thompson, any reaction to the situation?
Yeah, actually several pieces. First of all, I mean, everybody wants a magic threshold. When this happens, then you do this. Well, we know it's you know, you just can't have one big magic threshold to go purely online or to stay face-to-face or whatever. Several things that Peter mentioned, and so did Robert, that's important. Our campuses have spent tons of money preparing their campuses to be safe, But students have a responsibility here that's tremendous. Today, I mean, I have an op-ed that was released today that talks about this, student responsibilities in that regard. So, and you know, you can't have one statewide metric, even though we've been working and we work almost daily with our health officials and talking about what to look for. We have all of these things down as UNC Chapel Hill did, and they decided to pull the trigger on going online. But there's a million different ways of looking at this. Most of it has to be local. Most of it, though, has to also be predictive about what's going to happen in the next 3 or 4 weeks. It's not just what's going on now. You know, with all the other things that are out there, will this be increasing over the next 3 or 4 weeks? And if you see that it is, and that's going to cause a significant issue, then that's the metric you're using, more than just what's going on currently. So for those who are looking for a magic metric to decide which way to go, you won't find one. It's kind of hard because there's too many. So what we've done in Kentucky, most of our campuses have a dashboard of the top many things that are taking place that they're looking at, and then trying to derive themselves at what's the local way of enforcing that. Robert, I would be remiss if I didn't agree with you. Many of our campuses are we've lost so much money during this process, especially when there's been revenue shortfalls from the state. You know, whether it's residential hall living or whatever that you get paid for, many of our campuses, I mean, even big athletic conferences matter here, right? So what you're going to find is, though, that at least in Kentucky, none of our campuses will be in a situation whereby they would risk the health of their students, faculty, and staff for a dollar. I mean, I just don't see that. However, that's why we give so much consideration to the needs of the folk that are working at those institutions. So there's no magic one metric is what I would want you to take away from this.
Yep. Thanks, Dr. Thompson. That makes a lot of sense. Robert, brief last word, or should we go to the next question?
Let's go to the next question.
Great. So this is from Marguerite Morley, who we believe is from Fayetteville Tech Community College. And she asked about something that we've heard frequently in these discussions, which is the issue of coursework that requires in-person, hands-on components. She gives the example of automotive programs. How have institution leaders been thinking about this particular subset of coursework, and whether there are ways to prioritize or make these specific courses work within the context of online or hybrid reopening plans? I think we'll go back to Peter. I'll give you a chance to respond first, and then we'll go to Dr. Thompson and Robert.
Yeah, James, not being as close to that as, say, a college president would be, I'm not sure that I have a whole lot that I can offer to the person from Arkansas. I know we have some of our community college folks on the line as well, but I know our colleges, particularly the ones teaching technical programs with a lot of hands-on activity, are doing all they can to make the conditions as safe as possible. Certainly it won't be the same and it can't be as intimate as we're accustomed to, but I think we're going to see a lot of creativity here over the next several months.
Yes, I agree with that. Dr. Thompson,
we've had to do that, and I gave you the example in May when we did exactly that. We worked with our employers and with our campus leaders, and we provided a social distance, in some cases one-on-one way of doing it. My son is in studio now, as a matter of fact. He's an artist, and he has studio time where it's socially distanced. The professors are there instructing in a way that is very safe, and they cordon off different places whereby they've expanded that. Our employers are working with us in a very social distance way to make sure they get that hands-on training that they need. So for us, even our ATC, or area technical centers in our P12, we're working with them to provide them a space at our community colleges to do some of that, even to expand their boundaries. So our goal is to continue as well as we can Now, it won't be exactly like it was. I mean, where you have just tons of people in one venue. We're sticking to the guidelines of being socially distanced, mask. I mean, the things you can imagine, hand washing, you know, taking temperature checks before coming in, having a self-assessment before they walk in. We're doing all those things that the CDC, the White House, and then our state folk are asking us to do in that regard.
Thanks, Dr. Thompson. Robert, anything you've been hearing on this in regards to Seton Hall or from your nationwide tracking?
Yeah, colleges are prioritizing the things that absolutely need to be in person, whether it's due to accreditation reasons or things that just need to be hands-on. And then among things that could be in person but don't necessarily have to be, they're making choices based on resources and space. A lot of colleges are moving their largest lecture classes fully online so they can keep some of the smaller classes in person so students have something on campus. And they may be prioritizing first-year students over other undergraduates and undergraduates over graduate students for on-campus time because capacity is just limited and they're making tough choices.
Hey, James, this is Peter. Can I jump in? I'd like to follow up with Aaron or maybe Robert too. I'm thinking about like performing arts too. Aaron, you mentioned your son, and you know, theater and music and studio art and you know, architecture. I mean, where you have a lot of really a lot of intimacy and a lot of, you know, expression through your mouth and so forth. I mean, what are you hearing? How do we do this?
Well, I mean, Peter, you hit the nail on the head, especially for those that are performing with their mouth, such as opera and other folks. I mean, and of course, that's the way the disease is spread. In those cases, people are doing videos as an example, a way to do it online. There's some ways of expressing yourself through that mechanism, easier than it is if my son is building something. He showed me last night as an example, you know, 3 art architecture paintings that he did that was done long distance. I mean, he did it himself, but his instruction was long distance. He was actually in Spain when he did it. So point being is that there are ways that it can be done. This is where I know we're going to talk, James, a little bit about innovation. A part of the way we think about innovation is how do we focus on this learning process that Peter is bringing up, and not just on the teaching. We sometimes do things, and I'm an old professor, you know, I've held every kind of position you can name in education and higher ed. But I can tell you that if it was left up to me now to get online and teach a course, I don't think I would do it. But what I know is that we've got to start thinking differently about what engagement means. And no matter what course or what major that our students have.
Thanks, Dr. Thompson. That is another perfect segue into a question we just got from Representative Craig Horn of North Carolina. Hello, Representative. Thanks for joining us. Representative Horn asks, how are you all working with professors to improve exactly what you talked about, their skill in having to innovate in things like online instruction? How are they pivoting to this new method of instruction delivery? How can you support that? And the other side of that coin, how can you also help support students who now have to adapt to kind of a new modality of the way that they learn? So kind of exactly building on what Dr. Thompson just said. Maybe we'll go to Robert first. Do you want to take this one?
Sure. There have been a lot of training sessions for faculty and staff as well as students on using different types of technology. That the spring, a lot of universities or colleges shut down for a week or so. It was timed fairly well with spring break in many places to give everyone a crash course on how to use all the technology they may not have used. And many faculty have used this already. But over the summer, colleges had more time to provide some training for online or hybrid models of education. And then in some places, students have the option to take different modules to help. So there's been some training. It's never perfect. It's never enough. But students are demanding a better experience than the emergency online education of spring, and colleges have to deliver it.
Thanks, Robert. Peter, anything you're hearing in Virginia in terms of training for either faculty or students in terms of the online learning models?
I don't think I have anything to add beyond what James said. I guess I've always believed that students are probably a step or two ahead of the faculty as far as their savviness with the technology, and that they probably drive more change than the other way around. So I would imagine that they're a pretty adaptive group.
We, when we in March, the second week in March, we went down, we spent the next 2 weeks really getting faculty, campus presidents and provosts, spent that 2 weeks getting faculty ready to finish the rest of the semester. Now, over the summer, we took that time and we really started innovating the way that we can go into the fall with the idea that we were going to be offering probably most of our classes in some digital format. And they've done that. And in fact, they looked at what didn't work in the spring and tried to innovate on that. But a couple of things we did in my office, my VP for academic affairs and student success and others, we start creating ways to work with faculty to give them a variety of webinars, a variety of ways to have more learning in the areas they felt they needed to. I have a faculty advisory group that advises me. We got information from them. We implemented that process. I have a student advisory work group, and we talked about what was bad and what was good, what happened, what didn't happen, what should we do. So we tried to offer as much of that resource in our office as we possibly can, but really our campuses, all of them, went in full mode of looking at how they could do this fall better than the spring. No matter how, I mean, some of our campuses that were digitally connected didn't have much of an issue, but those that were offering 45% of their total classes online in the spring and had to go 100%, well, there was a learning curve. And we've taken that information through a SWOT analysis and start developing processes in my office and on campus to try to address those.
Great. Thank you all so much. Coming up, just about 11 minutes left. We have a ton of great questions in the queue, and I do apologize that we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But for kind of our last question before we close things out, two folks asked about this issue, so it rises to the top. First comes from Greg Schuckman from UCF, who was very complimentary of both of the SHIOs on this panel today. And the other person who asked about this is Stephanie Murphy. Both of them raised the issue of legal liability and the potential of liability as a shield, and basically how questions about legal liability could factor into some of these reopening decisions. So we'll do kind of a lightning round if keep your responses as brief as possible. Looks like Peter's deep in thought, so maybe we'll go to Dr. Thompson and then Peter and then Robert.
Well, one of the first things we did, and with the help of SREB, even Peter, you may remember Southern Regional Board, they worked with us. We had an attorney. Then we brought attorneys in front of us with their presidents, and we looked at all of those things. Bottom line, you can never stop from getting sued, especially if you can't predict what could happen. But what we know is that we figured out if we did everything to err on the side of the safety of the students, then we had a good leg to stand on. But we brought quickly attorneys in. We still do, because as we find out more information about this, what could be an issue of legal liability, then we are trying to address that as we go. But bottom line, we quickly, not as much as we worked with health experts, but we've worked with legal experts as we go through all of these things. Of course, we looked at all this before coming back this fall. We looked at all this in as much of detail as we possibly can.
We've been working very closely with our Office of the Attorney General on these issues, and they pretty much said the same thing Aaron just said, that you will be sued. And so be prepared, and to, as long as you're acting in as good faith as possible, I think having the reopening plans and some review by SHEV, the Department of Health, following the governor's guidance is good. It's It's not impenetrable from a legal perspective, but it's good. And so we expect there to be some lawsuits related to this. There is legislation in the special session that I mentioned a little while ago that's starting today that would provide some limited liability or a higher threshold for review on liability questions, not just for colleges, universities, but for all businesses in Virginia that are public facing in particular. So there are very live issues related to this. I'm sure we'll be sued, and our colleges, universities are as committed to safety as to anything. So, we'll just see what happens. I don't know. Thanks, Greg, for that question.
And
Robert?
from the faculty perspective, liability waivers are a little bit more contentious in that some faculty are concerned that they didn't get the ability to choose the way that they're teaching in the fall. And they're concerned about basically, does negligence get covered or not? And some of the language that faculty and students are being asked to sign seems to say colleges are covered in case of negligence, others not. How much of this will hold up in court, I don't know. But it certainly is a contentious point, and there's a lot more to be resolved out of that. Much of this probably in court in about 2023.
We will do a follow-up webinar in 2023, specifically on this liability issue. We've got about 7 minutes left. I'd love to close things out. We've been talking a lot about the immediate term, where many people's focus rightly is at the moment. But as we close out, I'd love for each of our great panelists to think a little bit in the medium and long term in terms of implications of this pandemic, and particularly back to Dr. Thompson's point about innovation. How do you think this pandemic and the resulting pivots that people are having to make might spur some innovation in how institutions think about course delivery models, not just for this fall semester, but for the coming years ahead? We'll go to Peter, then Dr. Thompson, then Robert.
So on the innovation front, briefly, there'll be new industries that arise out of this. And I was reading in the morning paper about pizza chains have seen their business go up, 30%, their profits. And so anyway, there's going to be new businesses. There's going to be new industry opportunities around how to do a Zoom meeting. There's all kinds of new learning ways that we can leverage some of the technology and online, and people who might not have felt comfortable with it in the past have experienced an enormous pivot. We converted over 30,000 courses in a matter of weeks in Virginia back in the spring. So I think there'll be all kinds of innovation that we cannot anticipate. I'll keep that very short. But I think one of the larger issues, I want to bring it back to what Javed said at the beginning, and it's on the equity gaps. And so I think one of a significant consequence of what we're experiencing is the unequal impact of the pandemic on people of color in particular, and then how that ripples through our higher education systems, and our responsibility to have more affirmative outreach to make sure that is not made worse than it already is. So I steered a little bit off of innovation, but I think that's really an important point that we have to keep in front of mind.
Let me state the obvious. Higher education has been designed around closeness and engagement. So what we've done here, my argument is that if we get good learning through this process, that's an innovative process. I don't want to forget about that, because we think of innovation as what's going to happen versus what is currently happening. And I would argue that strategically, we need to look at and assess closely all of those elements that we had in our strategic plan before, true enough. But what are the things now we can look at? For an example, most of our campuses, or many of our campuses, had an online fee that was extra to do courses online. Well, I think if not all of them, all but one so far, has taken that off, because we realize it's a new way of doing business. It's going to be the way to do business. We have an opportunity now to develop processes and strategies and inputs that's going to get many of our adult learners back engaged, which we really, truly need. We also have to understand the traditional age population groups are, as Peter said earlier, this is their item. So we've got an opportunity to really focus on learning. We've got an opportunity to understand that we're going to need to close now an extra gap, the digital divide. I could keep on going forever with this. What I can tell you is out of my office, these are the things that we currently know, but we want to put in place a process of even continually identifying items that we can innovate around. I mean, think about being at home and the entrepreneurial opportunities we have of building a way to think about our economic infrastructure now. I mean, so all of these things that we're talking about now, I think gives us an opportunity to continually assess and just put that as a part of our strategic agenda. That process in itself is innovative that we may not have. We talked about innovation, but we've never put things in what I call the mechanics of the system to create that opportunity to think about and produce innovation. So that to me will be the biggest outcome.
And quickly, first thing, quite a few colleges are not thinking about the medium and long-term implications right now. It is pure on survival mode for quite a few colleges and universities, in part because nobody knows how long this new normal is going to continue. But once we get past that, colleges will have some sort of an online infrastructure built up. We may be moving away from the fall spring dominant model in the four-year sector to really follow our community colleges that go more year round. That takes changes on faculty and staff, but it helps use facilities and resources better. The challenge also is that colleges aren't going to be able to make major investments for a while, given what this will do to resources. It's figuring out how do we use what we have better with the unlikelihood of major resources coming for a while.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks to Peter and Dr. Thompson as well for this terrific discussion. Again, apologies that we weren't able to get to all the questions. We will try to follow up as much as we are able to do so. Just in this last minute here, I would like to let you know about a couple of upcoming programming options that we have here at the Hunt Institute. We've got a great slate of webinars coming up for the next couple months. You can find them on the website there. The two most immediate options are this Thursday at 2 o'clock, the next installment in our Race and Education series on building the next generation of diverse teacher leaders. And then a week from today, we'll have the next installment in our Supporting Innovation in Education series, where we'll talk about different strategies to help higher education students succeed during a pandemic. Thanks again to our three wonderful panelists. Thanks to everyone who tuned in and asked a question. We appreciate you very much, and we hope to see you again on a Hunt Institute webinar soon.